One of the greatest challenges we have as Christian parents is to pass on the faith to our children, not just in theory, but through the living and active Word of God. That's why we've created Teach Me the Faith. It's a brand new podcast from Generations, and it's based on our Scripture Memory Catechism, helping children learn who God is, what He has done, and how to walk in His ways. One question, one verse, and one simple episode at a time. It's short, it's clear, and it's meant to be done together as a family, on the way to school, around the dinner table, or before bed. So start listening today at teachmethefaith.com. That's teachmethefaith.com.
Rousseau's utopian pipe dreams are supposed to draw in the gullible masses. He proposes a world of maximum freedom through autonomy, where man is a law to himself. Somehow, the state is supposed to protect everyone. Yet the individual is left to, quote, obey himself alone, unquote, which is the goal of humanism. Natural man or humanist man wants to be left alone, to obey himself alone. Of course, this is not freedom. In the biblical perspective, this is sin. When Eve succumbed to the temptation in the garden, the devil promised that she would determine good and evil for herself. As modern man rejects God as lawgiver and seeks to obey himself alone, he is self-consciously embracing the original sin committed by Adam and Eve. Thus, the source of law for Rousseau is man, while the source of law for the Christian is God.
You're listening to Passing on the Faith, a podcast from Generations. Every week, we bring you a powerful moment from one of our sermons, audiobooks, webinars, or conference talks, handpicked to help you build a strong biblical foundation for your family. This week's episode is a chapter from our audiobook, Apostate, entitled Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Forming the Humanist Society.
Chapter 6, Forming the Humanist Society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, A.D. 1712 to 1778. The great philosophers presented in this book are all intellectual giants who exerted enormous influence upon the Western world. Their ideas set the direction for entire nations, cultures, and civilizations. They form the worldview that undergirds the thinking and life of the average person living in Europe, Asia, and America today. Few others in the history of the world have exerted this much influence upon the lives of so many people. Their ideas were utterly ruinous. Temporarily, they threatened the kingdom influence of Jesus Christ in the Western world. It is important that my reader gain a sense of the sheer magnitude of that intellectual influence which eroded a Christian civilization in the West and elsewhere around the world. After 1,500 years of Christian dominance, these men managed to empty the churches, secularize education, paganize the culture, eradicate the nuclear family economy, and build the modern humanist state. A few of them, like John Dewey and Friedrich Nietzsche, self-consciously realized and openly acknowledged their opposition to Jesus Christ himself. Herein lies a challenge to the faith of the Christian believer. Would these men set themselves against the influence and efforts of the risen Christ? If Jesus Christ is ruling on the right hand of the Father, this can only be seen as a temporary setback. If we believe that Christ is head over all principalities and powers in the present era, we can be sure that these humanist giants and the ideas they espoused will soon fall. They will tumble like Dagon before the Ark of the Covenant. Quote, "What is the exceeding greatness of his power to usward who believe, according to the working of his mighty power, which he wrought in Christ, when he raised him from the dead and set him at his own right hand in the heavenly places, far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also in that which is to come, and hath put all things under his feet, and given him to be the head over all things to the church. Ephesians 1:20-22. Influence. Of all the modern Nephilim, the most imposing figure may very well have been the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was the pivotal philosopher who gave birth to the modern age, which historians generally agree began in 1820. When Will Durant set out to write his extensive history of the world, he dedicated an entire volume to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Says Durant, Rousseau, quote, had more effect upon posterity than any other writer or thinker of that 18th century in which writers were more influential than they had ever been before, unquote. Rousseau's fingerprints are all over the institutions of the modern world. Schools, churches, and governments have incorporated his ideologies into their organizational methodologies. For example, governments antedating the modern age barely consumed 5 to 10% of their national incomes. After Rousseau, democratic statism came to dominate almost every nation in the world, and now most governments consume over 50% of their national income. The political, social, and educational institutions that provide the modern context for life on planet Earth were very much defined by this man. In turn, the churches were forced to accommodate the social systems imposed upon them. Tragically, the political revolutions in France, Germany, China, and Russia that ended in the deaths of hundreds of millions of people were rooted in Rousseau's revolutionary doctrine. Karl Marx's communist ideologies, including the elimination of private property ownership, initially appeared in Rousseau's social contract. Historian Paul Johnson recognizes Rousseau as the most influential of all the philosophers who gave birth to the modern world. In Johnson's words, Rousseau was, quote, the first of the modern intellectuals, their archetype, and in many ways the most influential of them all. Older men like Voltaire had started the work of demolishing the altars and enthroning reason. But Rousseau was the first to combine all the salient characteristics. The assertion of his right to reject the existing order in its entirety, confidence in his capacity to refashion it from the bottom in accordance with principles of his own devising, belief that this could be achieved by the political process, and not least recognition of the huge part instinct, intuition, and impulse play in human conduct, unquote. The first of the modern revolutions took place in the 1790s under the auspices of Maximilien François-Marie Isidore de Robespierre, the chief architect of the French Revolution. Rousseau had the most significant influence on the revolutionary Robespierre, although Rousseau was dead by the time the revolution commenced. Robespierre was particularly proud of his acquaintance with the philosopher behind the revolution. In a letter to Rousseau, he wrote, quote, I saw you during your last days, and the memory remains a source of pride and joy. I contemplated your august features and saw on them marks of dark disappointments, to which you were condemned by the injustice of mankind, unquote. If ideas have consequences, it was the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that brought about the spirit of revolution, the reign of terror, the guillotine, the forced redistribution of wealth, and 40,000 dead bodies. Regrettably, the horror did not end with Robespierre's execution. Biographer Otto Scott wrote, quote, Robespierre died, but folly has a virulence that outlasts its inventor. He inspired more communes, more voices of virtue, more Lenins and Castros and Maos, more murder and hatred, more death and misery than any other of the sacred fools that have emerged to plague honest men." Unquote. Rousseau was to Robespierre what Marx was to Lenin and Mao. First come the ideas and then the consequences. What was it that Jesus Christ told us? "Ye shall know them by their fruits." It is hard to pinpoint which of Rousseau's writings were most influential, for social contracts shaped political states everywhere, but Emile may have been the most damaging of all. The book was radical for its day. When Rousseau told fathers they owed, quote, "their children to the state," unquote, he laid out a fundamental social view that would dominate for the next 3 centuries. Plato had alluded to this in the Republic, but no other empire or nation had ever used language which required such absolute subservience to a civil magistrate as this. You would have had to search long and hard to find any small city-state over the 4,000 years of world history leading up to Rousseau's life that mandated a compulsory attendance law in order to indoctrinate hundreds of millions, if not billions, of citizens in statist ideologies. Rousseau's ideas provided the fertile ground that the statist educational theory needed to thrive in the 19th and 20th centuries. This philosopher's vision for statist education found acceptance in Prussia at around the same time of the publication of Emile, 1763 to 1765. It would have taken another century before America incorporated these compulsory attendance laws. The modern statist system was finally in place when the state of Mississippi finally adopted the law in 1917. Rousseau's life. As with the other great apostate minds, Rousseau backslid out of a rich Christian heritage. Born in Geneva, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the grandson of a Calvinist preacher. His mother died within a week of his birth, and his father abandoned him to a boarding school in his 10th year. 5 years later, he set out to wander around Switzerland on his own. Still homeless and rootless at 16, he attempted to commit adultery with another man's wife, commencing a long life of serial fornication. As an adult, Rousseau's philosophy turned sharply towards humanism, which some believe was related to his antipathy to the biblical view of human nature. Tragically, he noted in his writings that followers of Christ would not make good citizens. Such dangerous words would pave the way for the persecution of Christians in France and other humanist nations. He also revived the old myth that it was Christianity that had weakened the Roman state and brought about the fall of Rome. This is not to say that Rousseau did not believe in God or did not advocate some of the truths of Scripture here and there throughout his writings. In a nation where 1,000 years of Christianity still permeated the culture, it would have been imprudent for this apostate to avoid God altogether. In 1765 France, the establishment would not have paid much attention to a self-proclaimed atheist. Nevertheless, the apostasy from Christian orthodoxy was moving along smartly in Rousseau's day. Throughout his writings, Rousseau clearly exalted human reason over divine revelation. He repudiated the doctrine of hell, rejected original sin outright, denied miracles, and considered all religions as equally credible. 20 years before Emile, a life-changing event occurred with the philosopher when his live-in girlfriend birthed his first child. Immediately, Rousseau bundled up the baby and deposited it on the steps of an orphanage. This happened to be during the dead of winter, a time when babies disposed of in such a way had a scant chance of survival. In subsequent years, the wretch had a total of 5 children, and each received the same derelict treatment. Sadly, there are no records concerning the gender of the children, for Rousseau never cared about such things. Concerning this great philosopher's gross moral failure, Paul Johnson writes, quote, "What began as a process of personal self-justification gradually evolved into the proposition that education was the concern of the state. By a curious chain of infamous moral logic, Rousseau's iniquity as a parent was linked to his ideological offspring, the future totalitarian state." Unquote. "Ye shall not afflict any widows or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless." Exodus 22:22-24. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the prototypical liberal hypocrite who kills his baby in the mornings and argues passionately for welfare redistributions to the indigent in the afternoon. Incredibly, Rousseau referred to himself as the greatest lover of mankind who ever lived. "I love myself too much to hate anybody," he once noted. His raw hubris and narcissism were altogether without limit. "If there were a single enlightened government in Europe," he told somebody, "it would have erected statues to me. It will then be no empty honor to have been a friend of Jean-Jacques Rousseau." These words came from a man who abandoned his own children on the steps of an orphanage and refused to honor the mother of his children with even a wedding ring. His acquaintances were particularly annoyed by his obnoxious habit of urinating in public. His self-conceit knew no bounds. He would gush, quote, "The person who can love me as I can love is still to be born. No one has ever had more talent for loving. I was born to be the best friend that ever existed. I would leave this life with apprehension if I knew a better man than me. Show me a better man than me, a heart more loving, more tender, more sensitive. Posterity will honor me, because it is my due. I rejoice in myself. My consolation lies in my self-esteem." Unquote. Rousseau's live-in girlfriend stayed with him for 33 years, despite the fact that he, quote, "never felt the least glimmering of love for her." In retrospect, Rousseau may have been the prototypical narcissist. He wrote, quote, "The sensual needs I satisfied with her were purely sexual and were nothing to do with her as an individual. I told her I would never leave her and never marry her." Unquote. All the while, he maintained a relationship with another woman, Sophie Dudetou, whom he described, quote, "the first and only love of my life." Unquote. Evidently, she didn't think much of him. After his death, she called him, quote, "a pathetic figure, an interesting madman." Unquote. It is fitting that this is the father of the secular state and the modern compulsory public education system. He is the father of the world where 40 to 50% of children are born outside of wedlock, and the state promises, womb to tomb, social security for everyone. This is the madman who constructed our modern world. He had immense influence on John Dewey. Now billions of people follow his ideas over the wisdom of the old Christian order. As social systems continue to crumble around us, future generations will look back in disbelief at the foolishness of those who accepted Rousseau's thinking without question. They will wonder why so many people were taken by the ideas of a lunatic. Then they will know that all those who hate wisdom love death. Proverbs 8:36. God has a way of teaching his truth by historical object lessons. He makes it easy for us to see why we shouldn't follow a self-consumed narcissist who urinated in public and abandoned his 5 children on the steps of an orphanage. What makes the lesson so rich is that it is only learned after test driving his prescribed social order for 300 years. Rousseau was highly influential, hopelessly utopian, wildly arrogant, and outrageously popular among academics. He was the archetypal humanist philosopher who lives in an ivory tower, loving mankind but hating any real person he ever met, especially his own family, children, and common-law wife. In his writings, Rousseau provided some insight into what he was thinking when he abandoned his children on the steps of an orphanage. Quote, "How could I achieve the tranquility of mind necessary for my work, my garret filled with the domestic cares and the noise of children?" Unquote. In other words, how could he ever create a utopia for the rest of the world without providing a hell for his own children? By the end of his sad life, Rousseau was hated by almost everybody who knew him. But the tragic part of the story is that most of the world loved him and followed him as they developed their democracies, their socialist states, their literature, school, and fragmented families. This deranged madman created a new world in his own image. Now, Rousseau's orphanage is much expanded in the form of government-funded day schools, kindergarten, preschools, daycares, and foster care. In our country, over 50% of children born to women under 30 years of age are born without fathers, and 64% of children under 6 are left alone for large portions of the day. The state controls almost all the education programs in most developed countries around the world, and parental freedoms are increasingly disappearing in the European Union and the United States. It would be difficult to construct a fictional character as twisted, pathetic, or evil as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Yet, he is treated as a sort of god by many modern thinkers. Incredibly, Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher of the 19th century, described Rousseau as one who possessed, quote, "a sensibility of soul of unequaled perfection," unquote. Leo Tolstoy, the towering literary genius from Russia, said that Rousseau and the gospel had been, quote, "the 2 great and healthy influences of my life," unquote. Percy Shelley referred to him as, quote, "a sublime genius," and John Dewey, the father of modern education, praised Rousseau as, quote, "the greatest educational reformer of modern times." We are incredulous. What spell did this man cast upon the philosopher class and the whole world that came after him? How could men of such intellectual stature reduce themselves to such foolishness in their commendations of a fool? There was something profoundly perverse and unsound about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his ideas. If this be the case, there must be something very misguided with those minds who cannot find any problem with him. There must be something very wrong with our world. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth forth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. Matthew 7:16-20. Philosophy. From the very first words of social contract, Rousseau veers off the biblical track and abandons his Christian roots. He writes, quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," unquote. The words sound good to the humanist mind, but not to the mind of a man trained to think according to a biblical anthropology. Actually, man is born enslaved to sin. Romans 6, verse 16, Psalm 51, verse 5, and Ephesians 2, verse 1. And this constitutes his basic problem. However, the modus operandi of humanist leaders is always to point out man's tertiary problems, promising a redemption that fails to address the root issue. In the end, the humanist misses the root problem by a mile, and his solutions are no solutions at all. He riles up the masses against their social systems and their local fiefdoms, only to shift them over to another form of tyranny under large, powerful nation-states. Thus, the humanist moves his people from the frying pan into the fire, because he is unwilling to deal with man's primary issue. Jesus Christ addresses a nation enslaved to the Roman power when he says, quote, "Whosoever commits sin is a servant of sin. If the Son will make you free, you will be free indeed." John 8, 34 through 36. In Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau explicitly rejects the biblical view of man, which describes man's nature as sinful and depraved. Romans 3, verses 9 through 18. According to Rousseau, primitive, natural man has no depraved nature, but he is perfect, quote, "in potentio," unquote. It is rather a wrongly ordered society that is responsible for the bad things in the world. Of course, Rousseau points to the old Christian order as the aberrant society and the source of modern man's problems. He wants to replace Christian society with something better. At root, he believes that the right social system, the right ideas, and the right civil orders in power will form man into a better creature. Whatever the old order has yielded is unacceptable to Rousseau. So he advocates a revolutionary agenda that must involve the state. Rousseau continues in The Social Contract, quote, "The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before," unquote. Here, Rousseau's utopian pipe dreams are supposed to draw in the gullible masses. He proposes a world of maximum freedom through autonomy, where man is a law to himself. Somehow, the state is supposed to protect everyone. Yet the individual is left to, quote, "obey himself alone," unquote, which is the goal of humanism. Natural man or humanist man wants to be left alone to obey himself alone. Of course, this is not freedom. In the biblical perspective, this is sin. When Eve succumbed to the temptation in the garden, the devil promised that she would determine good and evil for herself. As modern man rejects God as lawgiver and seeks to obey himself alone, he is self-consciously embracing the original sin committed by Adam and Eve. Thus, the source of law for Rousseau is man, while the source of law for the Christian is God. Of course, fallen man is more than happy to take the place of God and become his own lawgiver. Contrary to Rousseau's hopes and aspirations, this sinful inclination does not produce maximum freedom, nor does it release man from his chains. In the end, this rebellion always heightens governmental tyranny, which is exactly what happened in nations that followed Rousseau's ideas. The founding fathers of this country would have rejected Rousseau's words out of hand. For example, Benjamin Franklin is known for his quip, quote, "Either you will be governed by God, or by God you will be governed," unquote. That is, either man must submit himself to the laws of God, or he will find himself tyrannized by God's sovereign ordination. These men understood the importance of obedience to the laws of God, while Rousseau did not. But it gets worse. Rousseau's overweening confidence in human nature and his rejection of God's law produces a dreadful social theory. He admires the natural man who is born free and lives for himself, but he hopes that this man will grow into the ideal citizen, a slave of the socialist state. This man is, quote, "but the numerator of a fraction, whose value depends on its denominator. His value depends upon the whole, that is, on the community. Good social institutions are those best fitted to make a man unnatural, to exchange his natural independence for dependence, to merge the unit in the group so that he no longer regards himself as one, but as a part of the whole, and is only conscious of the common life," unquote. Thus, Rousseau cannot find the happy medium between the ultimacy of the individual and the ultimacy of the corporate body. He cannot draw a fine line between the one and the many, or between the anarchy of the individual, who does whatever he wants to do, and the tyranny of the corporate state that dictates all human action. Christians believe that the one and the many are equally ultimate in God himself, the Trinity. In the self-consistent Christian mind, God is both one and three. This is what balances out a Christian social order, because Christians understand both individual liberty and the structure of the corporate body politic are important for a stable society. At this point, however, the Western world had already rejected Trinitarian Christianity as having nothing to do with philosophical knowledge or social orders. Therefore, the Western world devises its own political and social systems based on unaided human reason sans God's revelation. The state becomes ultimate for Rousseau. The individual unit entirely merges into the group, and the individual no longer regards his own individuality. This harmful philosophy has been and continues to be the source of all draconian tyrannies, social programming, bureaucratic machines, and Orwellian nightmares, which have abridged the freedoms for billions of people over the last 2 centuries. Our founding fathers did not trust government with unlimited power because of a right understanding and a fundamental mistrust of the nature of man. Rousseau, on the other hand, did not share this anthropology, so he created a world of tyranny, social disintegration, moral decay, and civil unrest. It is hard to comprehend the deceptive and dangerous character of Rousseau's social theory until we trace his ideas through to their ultimate consequences in France, Russia, China, and elsewhere. Rousseau's ill-fated word from Discourse on Inequality influenced Karl Marx, and then served as a fundamental operating principle for almost every modern nation. Quote, "The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, 'This is mine,' and found people naive enough to believe him, that man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch, and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" Unquote. Before the revolutions, Rousseau happily attributes all the horrors and misfortunes on earth to private property. But now, after all his bloody revolutions have run their course, we look back and discover that it was actually Rousseau and his messed up anthropology, sociology, and ethical theories that brought about the horrors and misfortunes. It is obvious from the quote above that Rousseau rejected the eighth commandment. When God wrote, "Thou shalt not steal," he established private property ownership. Moreover, in passages like Exodus 20:15 and Deuteronomy 19:14, the Bible requires a respect for private property and the means of production. Jesus Christ also confirmed this in Matthew 20:15, when the landowner in his parable claimed the right to determine the wages for his workers without government intervention. According to Christ, an employer has the right to set unequal pay for his workers as long as they accept the terms. The Lord would not have legitimized an unethical practice in his teachings. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an original, big government socialist at heart. He resolved the conflict between the will of the individual and the will of the people by insisting that the will of the people prevail. He refused to address this tension by submitting all individuals and social systems to the laws of God, the Trinitarian God. For any social system based upon human reason, it is easier to err on one side or the other than to hold to a metaphysical mystery that allows for both the one and the many to operate simultaneously. Some humanists want to turn individual man into God. Others will turn the corporate expression of man, the state, into God. Although Rousseau is tempted towards the first option, he settles for the second, because he would rather deify corporate, democratic man to the abandonment of individual liberties. Of course, he also had to reject family and church community as important elements of the human social system. As with many of the Enlightenment men, he held marriage in low esteem and never married. Rousseau's philosophy of education. Will and Ariel Durant summarize Rousseau's Emile in these words. Quote, Rousseau wanted a system of public instruction by the state. He prescribed many years with an unmarried tutor who would withdraw the child as much as possible from parents and relatives, unquote. Rousseau's weakness as a parent is evident in the very first section of his book Emile, where he at first entertains the notions that fathers ought to educate their own children and then dispenses with it altogether as impractical. Per Rousseau, the father is expected to raise the child for the state, first and foremost. Quote, a father owes men to humanity, citizens to the state, unquote. Rousseau also refers to Plato's Republic as, quote, the finest book ever written on education, unquote. As it turns out, Plato's ideal social theory is radically antithetical to the biblical social theory. Plato said, quote, the wives of our guardians are to be common, and their children are to be common, and no parent is to know his own child, nor any child his parent. A woman, I said, at 20 years of age, may begin to bear children to the state, and continue to bear them until 40, unquote. In order for the humanist vision of society to progress, it is essential that family relationships are finally obliterated. Father-son relationships are unimportant to the humanist mind. The God-ordained covenant relationships of family and church are impediments to the humanist vision of the authoritarian, anonymous, all-powerful state. This was the pattern of Rousseau's life, with his own father and his own children, and he passed it on to future generations through his influential writings. Further in Emile, we find that Rousseau is impressed by a Spartan woman who did not care that her 5 sons were slain in battle. It was their winning for the victory of Sparta as a nation that brought her to rejoicing. Rousseau reveals more of his agenda for education in the 1755 publication, A Discourse on Political Economy, which he took the word economy, or oikonomia, and applied it to the government of a nation. Translated from the Greek, the word is rendered family law, or the vision of the family. In the first paragraph of his essay, Rousseau takes the word family and applies it to that great family, the state. Rousseau, the vagabond, the man without a family, must turn the state into his family. He further clarifies, quote, government ought less indiscriminately to abandon to the intelligence and prejudices of fathers the education of their children, as that education is of still greater importance to the state than to the fathers, unquote. Over previous centuries, education has been a matter of family and church jurisdiction. In order to bring about the powerful modern nation-state that is so important to his vision, Rousseau understands that government-funded education is indispensable. In order to move modern nations towards total government by democracy, education would have to come under the purview of the state. The state-controlled education system would then become a juggernaut, a force that would be irrepressible by any conservative or distributist coalition. This is the only way in which the state can replace the family and bring the majority of the population into dependence upon state welfare and state employment. As the state replaces the family by its welfare programs, education programs, medical programs, and economic systems, eventually fathers become obsolete. This destroys family economies and creates a society where the majority of children are raised without fathers involved in their lives, and the majority of marriages end in divorce. Rousseau goes on to describe education as, quote, the most important business of the state, unquote. What a genius! Given that no other empire in the history of man had pulled off this level of total government involvement in the lives of the citizens as envisioned by Rousseau, his visionary capabilities were nothing short of phenomenal. For these ideas to have borne such enormous influence upon so many nations, so many institutions, and so many humans in our world, there must have been higher spiritual forces at work. To the Christian mind trained in biblical truth, Rousseau's educational program is revolutionary and appalling. He completely rejects the wisdom of the book of Proverbs. If the book of Proverbs told us A, Rousseau says not A. Here are a few choice nuggets. Quote, it is not part of a child's business to know right and wrong. Unquote. Quote, give your scholar no verbal lessons. Unquote. Quote, never make him say, forgive me, for he does not know how to do you wrong. Unquote. Quote, he deserves neither punishment nor reproof. Unquote. Quote, the only natural passion is self-love, or selfishness taken in wider sense. This selfishness is good in itself. Unquote. Christians ought to recognize that this social theory counters a biblical social theory. However, because many Christians frame their ethical and social systems by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx more than by the Bible, they have unknowingly and enthusiastically participated in this vision. They have effectively followed the apostasy and adopted a humanist worldview. But those who use Scripture to determine the jurisdictional boundaries of family, church, and state instantly recognize the revolutionary and destructive nature of Rousseau's program. They know that state ownership of children is tyrannical and antithetical to freedom, as explained by the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel 8:11-13. They find that the enslaving of children to state-controlled economies and corporations is a shame to a free people. Nehemiah 5, verses 5 through 6. They are horrified by the elimination of family economies. They are repelled by a state-controlled system of education, since there is no example of it in Scripture, let alone any mandate for it. Throughout the Scriptures, God requires fathers to oversee and control the education of their children. Deuteronomy 6, verses 7 through 9, Ephesians 6, verse 4, Colossians 3, verse 21, 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 11, and the whole book of the Proverbs. Normatively, fathers and mothers raise their children. They teach their children and work towards family economic goals together. This is assumed in the fourth commandment. Exodus 20, verse 10, also reference Genesis 29, verse 9, 1 Samuel 17, verse 15, Matthew 4, verse 21. Revolutionary social systems, such as those proposed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, destroy family economies, family inheritance, family care for the elderly, family charitable systems, family-based voting, and family-centered education. Contribution to the Romantic period. The Enlightenment alone, with its focus on the supremacy of human reason, was insufficient to bring about the political and cultural revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. It is true that Rousseau started out as a firm believer in human reason. Before long, he followed every other humanist philosophy as he crossed the line from rationality and reason to irrationality and unreasonableness. Inevitably, the self-sufficient, arrogant humanist will abandon tradition and history. He rebels against the past and casts off the old social norms and morals. He takes on the revolutionary spirit, and he will trust in his own heart and feelings, regardless of the consequences. This is how Rousseau bridged the Enlightenment into the Romantic era. Rousseau is identified as the first of the Romantic thinkers. There would have been no Marx, no Nietzsche, and no Wagner without Jean-Jacques Rousseau's worldview of Romanticism. There would have been none of these bloody, senseless revolutions without Rousseau's revolutionary doctrine. The historians are right. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the most influential humanist thinker of the last 500 years. His ideas form the contours of modern life more than any others. He prepared the way for the social, political, and cultural revolutions that destroyed the family, eroded political freedoms, and unraveled entire civilizations. When the story is written of the decline and fall of Western civilization, Jean-Jacques Rousseau will head the first chapter. If the team of men who brought the Western world to its knees were arranged in a pyramid, the name Jean-Jacques Rousseau would take its place at the top.
This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.
Thanks for listening to Passing on the Faith. If you're looking for resources to disciple your kids and build a Christ-centered home, we'd love to help. Generations offers books, curriculum, devotionals, and tools designed to help you pass on the faith to the next generation. And just for our listeners, you can get 15% off your next order. Just use the code PASSING at checkout. That's PASSING for 15% off at generations.org. Thanks for supporting the mission of family discipleship.